Welcome to the Black Creator Series, brought to you by Candlewick Press in collaboration with Red Clay Educators. Hosted by Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul, bringing dynamic books, authors, illustrators, and artists to your classroom and to the world. Look for episodes of the Black Creator Series on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Here's Candlewick's Kathleen Rourke to introduce this week's guest.
Thanks for joining us. Our guest creator this episode is author and filmmaker David Barclay Moore. His debut novel, The Stars Beneath Our Feet, was a Coretta Scott King, John Steptoe New Talent Author Award winner, a Time Magazine Top 10 Children's Book of the Year, and a New York Times Book Review Notable Children's Book. His incredible and thought-provoking picture book debut, Carry Me Back, gorgeously illustrated by John Holyfield, merges history and magic, and his school library journal noted in its starred review of the title, is a tale like no other and one not to be skipped. I now turn the conversation over to Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul, a New York Times bestselling author, educator, founder of Red Clay Educators, and co-founder of the Institute for Racial Equity in Literacy.
Hi, David. Welcome to the Black Creator Series.
Hey, Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you for being here. We're going to be talking about your incredible book, Carry Me Back, The Town That Walked. But first, I'm wondering, what are some of your favorite folk tales, ones that you enjoyed as a child and maybe even still today?
That's a great question. Obviously, for those who have read Carry Me Back, they may see some similarities between some like Virginia Hamilton, some of her excellent kind of folk tale, African-American folktale collections. For me, growing up, I was always a huge fan of mythology and folktales, and I was a huge geek. I tend to write about characters who are very geeky, such as myself. And so a lot of it, when I was very young, I read a lot of Norse mythology and Greco-Roman mythology. And when I got to be a little bit older into adolescence, I kind of discovered more kind of African and African-American folk tales, kind of the Brer Rabbit and Brer Bear, the Tar Baby, and the people who could fly, very kind of prominent African-American Southern folk tale was very important to me during that period. Just the whole concept of people, Black folks, enslaved Black folks getting that kind of freedom from that oppression and just flying away, And so I think a lot of the spirit in my picture book, Carry Me Back, encompasses some of that feeling as well, this whole thing of carry me back to where my people are from, to where I'm from, to where, like one of the characters in the book says, where we all come from.
Do you think folk tales are overlooked? And how might educators invite children into reading and also writing original folk tales?
No, that's another great question. I think for educators, particularly with young people, human beings have always loved stories, going back to the prehistoric times, when we would sit around fires and tell each other stories to kind of frighten or to scare away the night, the frights of the night, And we still have folk tales today, I think a lot of children today don't read as many of the traditional folk tales, like when I was, their age. But there are lots of folk tales that we have today. Or even stories that function like folk tales. Like for a great example, which is something that's incredibly popular with young people today, are the superhero mythos. Right? That's something that is any educator can get their hands on through either a DC or Marvel video rental or comic books, graphic novels. This the whole idea of Superman, which is probably the biggest out of those mythos. Is it's very folktale-ish and mythological, going back to like even like a lot of kind of ancient Hebrew roots. The whole mythos of Superman. Superman is almost kind of a type of Moses or a golem, right? The golem is a kind of ancient, kind of Jewish tradition of this savior who would stand in front of villages, ancient villages, and protect the villagers from whatever it is that would attack them, right? And so Superman is basically kind of like a type of golem, if you look at it that way. And the creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, were both Jewish, so a lot of people don't realize that kind of Superman's kind of genealogy, where it comes from, lots of things, even like the Mandalorian, which is very popular on Walt Disney, which is a Star Wars thing. That's very mythological and folktale-ish, with about different types of tribes and interactions and stuff like that. So I think those things can be wonderful kind of starting points in the classroom. And I think that if used wisely, they can open up kind of a larger world for the kids to kind of delve into, like kind of the more traditional kind of folk texts.
Yeah, I think that's super important and interesting, because I don't know, I'm pretty sure that connection was not made for me as a child. And you're right, so many children are, they know and revere the Superman, Spider-Man, Avengers, all of that. And to connect that to myths and folktales, I think could absolutely open the door to a lot of possibilities for kids to read more folktales and to write their own. I remember taking a children's literature course, and one of the assignments was to memorize and to deliver a folktale, and we could use musical instruments for part of our retelling movement, or other creative aspects as we told that story, in order to engage the audience. And I remember how nervous I was, but also absolutely elated. And, I think readers' theater is another powerful experience for children, and could invite students into folktales. If you do a search on Google of popular folktales, you're going to get things like Paul Bunyan, Brer Rabbit, Davy Crockett, Johnny Appleseed. It wasn't until much later in my life that I came across some of the folk tales that you started to talk about, the Anansi stories and The People Could Fly, stories about Africa and Black people. And so much of the tension around children's literature in this national moment involves erasure, right? And silencing of racial and cultural identities that are not the dominant majority. And yet we've really been navigating this issue in education forever. How do you see this issue impacting access to folk tales, fables, and myths? Why is it important for educators to learn about the folk tales that you mentioned loving, and to learn more than the ones that have been made popular and that have been canonized? Why is it important to have access to these?
Yeah, I mean, access is vital, and it's, as like so many of us today, I've been very saddened by this whole kind of book banning fever that's taken over certain parts of our country. I think it's very sad. It's symbolizes a lot of ignorance, and it's very the way I think a lot of the proponents of this banning, it's like sugar-coated racism, really, because they're saying that they don't want kind of offensive stories that make their children feel bad about themselves, but then they go on and they get really upset about a book, like when an author Jerry Craft's book, New Kid, which boggles my mind why you would find anything offensive. And it gets right down to, if you're going to look at it from that perspective, you just don't want people to show themselves, right, and to tell their own stories. That's, it's New Kid should not be banned anywhere. But, I think that, folk tales in the classroom, particularly if you start off, like I was talking about, with a kind of a jumping off point with some of the more modern folk tales with the comic book culture and Star Wars, and then using that to kind of get into some of the more traditional folk tales. I have a feeling that some of the more traditional folk tales might not be found as offensive, perhaps, to some of those, if you're teaching in an area like that, something that's a little bit more historically rooted, that's kind of a toss up whether or not. And even I think in some communities, though, a lot of people describe the Bible as a book of folk tales, right? So even that, there are lots of examples in the Bible, I think, of ways and different kind of themes that kind of a type of mythos, right? That could probably be used. And I think a lot of those different communities would find it very hard to object to, some of those stories at least. And unfortunately, I think, it's a shame to have to think that way. But I think that in today's environment, if you're teaching in certain areas, I think a lot of people just feel like their hands are tied, until we can kind of find a way to kind of correct, a lot of these injustices that are going on. People are going to have to find kind of creative ways around that to reach out to the kids.
Yeah. But, as we were just saying, we need educators to be more familiar with some of the folk tales and the stories that have Black people at the center, right? To not know about the Anansi tales, to not know about The People Could Fly, is to miss, literature that is so rich and important and makes visible Black people and children. Black children need access to those stories to see themselves reflected across all the genres of literature. Let's talk about Carry Me Back, the town that walked. And I'm just going to share it on my document camera.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So what made you want to write an original folktale, and from where does this incredible story emerge?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. I'm very proud of Carry Me Back. It's something that, like as I mentioned, I've always been a big fan of mythology and folklore, and I've always wanted. I have lots of stories in my head, kind of buzzing around in my head. I don't know exactly where this one came from. I think one of the very first kind of images that popped into my head was of a tiny little duck pulling a town across the countryside. I think that was kind of the crux of it, where a lot of the rest of it kind of sprang for it. And so it was one of the things, like when I'm writing something, I usually know if I'm hitting the right spot, if it flows very well, right? If it's kind of a smooth kind of, if it flows out of my brain, in a very smooth manner, almost kind of like water into a river, Yeah. And so that's kind of what happened with this. A similar thing happened with The Stars Beneath Our Feet, a children's novel. And so, once I got started, I just couldn't stop with it, and the story kind of came together. And I'm very, very happy with it. It's the first of a possible 3-book arc.
Oh, I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's beautifully illustrated.
Yeah.
John Holyfield did an amazing job.
Yes.
I have another picture book coming out this fall called Boyogi, which is also illustrated. Mm-hmm. Great. I've been lucky to be able to pair up with these wonderful illustrators. Noah Denman illustrated the new book, Boyogi. She's amazing. Yeah. And so I just feel very fortunate that my stories and words can be paired up with these beautiful imagery.
Yeah. So can we talk about the symbolism of the name Carry Me Back, right?
Sure.
I couldn't help but think about the West African concept, Sankofa, right? To retrieve, to go back, to return to the values from our knowledge of the past. We see in your folktale this community, this village leave for safety, for freedom, in order to return to their values and powerful ways of knowing and being. So that's not really so much a question, but more of a statement. And I want you to talk about the intentionality behind, naming this story, Carry Me Back.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I guess it could be a little controversial because there's this whole idea of this community of freed Black folks after, Carry Me Back takes place during the Reconstruction period, shortly after the end of the Civil War, in which a lot of us formerly enslaved individuals had to kind of fend for ourselves, right? And in the midst of that fending, also being attacked. And so, there's a time for fighting and there's a time for preserving oneself, right? And I don't think that you should do either one all of the time. I think there's times to stand up and push back and fight, which is what we're very used to as African Americans in this country. And there's also a notion of kind of removing oneself from antagonism, from danger, And we talked about the People Could Fly as an example of that. This kind of wanting to go home.
Yeah.
And so, there's a notion of that. There's also this idea of Mother Africa, where a lot of people don't realize that some of the earliest humans on the planet, if not the earliest, originated from that continent. And so there's an idea of kind of imparting some of that knowledge to young people, right? And also getting them to think, because a lot of young people will find themselves in the type of circumstance where they have to decide if they're going to preserve themselves and kind of extricate themselves from a dangerous situation, or stay and fight and possibly suffer the damages of that. Like I said, there's a time for everything. So, I think that I'm happy with the way it kind of represents that as this kind of alternative of like, well, you don't always have to kind of just stay and be, abused, right? You can remove yourself from that abuse.
Yeah. You're clearly very modest, but I want you to know that I think this book is pure genius because on the surface, right, this is an original folktale. It's a story about a village that had a threat, right, and what they did to survive, right? That's one way you could read, and take in this incredible story. However, this book is about so much more, right? It's about Black ingenuity, right? I love that Rutilla always used to say that she wasn't magic, but the things she made were. And the way this comes back across when Julius, makes a way for this community. So this book is about Black ingenuity. It is about Black resilience and resistance. It's also about systemic racism, right? We've got the white folks in town refusing to buy any goods or crops from the Black folks in town because of their harmful and racist ideas about Black people. It is about, white supremacy, right? It's about white rage and white terror, right? There's just so many ways in which you open the door for young readers to have these powerful conversations about race and racism, and for older readers to have, more sophisticated conversations about race and racism, and to, as you said, think about the parallels within the story and their lives right now. So what made you want to do that? What made you want to open the door for readers to have insights and, I hope, in-depth conversations about racism?
Oh, well, thank you, Doctor, so much for those. Thank you. I appreciate that, your observations and everything. And, I like to try whatever I do. I like that object, that rhetorical artifact, to serve kind of multiple purposes, And so I think that Carry Me Back in some ways does that. I think it's something that can be useful for very young ones, to learn from and to dialogue about and talk about, be exposed to kind of complex issues in a way that I think is age appropriate. And also, the majority of the time, adults are reading to those young ones, right? And so I think that there's definitely room there for the adults to explore and have a dialogues with the young ones about what's going on. And I also I have this thing I've been saying for a while, where you don't get pumpkins from planting watermelon seeds, right? There's roots for everything. And what we were talking about with the book banning earlier, I mean, a lot of those people that are banning these books don't understand the genesis for a lot of these problems, that we're having today. And not only do they not understand them, but they also reject them. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to make amends.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that it's very important to kind of understand why things are the way they are, where things come from. And even from a very early age, to be able to dialogue with it. I mean, I have a novel called Holler the Fireflies that came out last year. And it's a middle grade novel, but there's a section in there in which one of the characters says to another character, actually a Black character says to a white character, fix it. Fix it, and fix us and fix yourselves, something to that, right? And they're talking about something very specific within the novel, like it's something that's been broken that needs to be fixed. But there's also, within the context of the larger story, there's this whole idea of this damage that's been done to the African-American community here. And it really hasn't been addressed or repaired, right? Yeah. And so like I said, you don't get pumpkins from planting watermelon seeds. It has to be addressed in some way. Yeah. And so in Carry Me Back, that is one way of me trying to point attention to some of these core issues.
Yes, I love that, because reconciliation isn't possible. It just isn't possible without acknowledgement, without apology, and without accountability. So we talked about the incredible illustrator, John Holyfield.
Yeah.
Who brilliantly tells this story with incredible art. What was it like to collaborate on this project? And I'm excited to know that, there may be more.
Well, with most picture book projects, probably most people don't know this, but the publishers really try to discourage the writers and the illustrators from directly collaborating, right? So there's very little of that with this particular picture book. And for most picture books, I don't know exactly why it is. That's kind of a culture within picture book publishing. There obviously are examples of illustrators and writers that work very closely together, but for the most part, the publishers will try to discourage that. I think possibly dealing with like a writer and an illustrator who are both artists, right? Maybe wanting to try to avoid kind of, head bumping and passion, getting in the way.
Yeah.
People, because I have heard some horror stories of some prominent authors working with illustrators, and it didn't go well because them saying like, "Oh, I don't like how this looks," or whatever. So, so how I worked with John, we had most of the time like an intermediary, And my editor and the art director kind of worked as intermediaries for things. So I would have comments or whatever about certain things. And I also had an overall kind of view on how I wanted it to look, which was, I think, forwarded to him and stuff like that. But for the most part, if they can help, if they, if they can do it, they'll keep us apart, probably wisely.
Yeah, give the artist space to marinate in your words and see how that can exist artistically. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about what's now and next. We know that there may be more when it comes to Carry Me Back. And you also had mentioned earlier, Boy Yogi, and wondered if you would just talk a little bit about this book that readers can look forward to, hopefully soon.
Yeah. So Boy Yogi, I'm also very proud of it. It's basically the story of a father and son. And the father is a military person who has just returned home from overseas and is suffering from PTSD. And so his son, Butterbean, realizes that daddy has changed since before he left. And he kind of wonders if it's something that he's done or whatever. And so Butterbean has this really kind of age-appropriate conversation with his mother about basically mental health and the mind. She kind of explains to him what a mind is and how daddy's mind is kind of hurting. It's not like his skinned knee or something, or his tummy aches, it's his mind. And so they have a whole conversation about the mind and what that is. And the mother enrolls or drags the father to a yoga class at the local Brooklyn YMCA, which is a place I actually go to. And that and some other things help the father deal with his PTSD and helps bring the father and son closer together again. So I like it a lot. I mean, I think it's something that can be very useful in real life, for families and schools and other institutions to kind of use as another kind of starting point or touchstone for dealing with a lot of those issues.
Yeah. We talk a lot about emotional well-being in lots of different contexts, but I do think this is super important literature for educators to have a way into these kinds of discussions with children whose, families are navigating these kinds of issues when it comes to their emotional well-being, and also for children who are navigating issues related to their own emotional and mental well-being.
While I was at a conference, the NCTE conference in Anaheim, I was bumped into a Marine soldier, and his girlfriend, and they were staying at the hotel for some type of function at the hotel where I was staying. And we just struck up a conversation, we're chatting. I mentioned I'm a writer, and I showed them, or showed the Marine an image, very early image from Boy Yogi, which is the very first illustration, which is of the father embracing his son after he's returned from overseas. And I just love the work that Noah Denman has done with that, because it's just that illustration, it's very powerful. And it's basically there it is. It's amazing. And to me, it just looks like the father is holding on to his son like he never wants to let his son go again. And you can only imagine what the father has gone through to put him in that type of mental space, right? That type of emotional space.
Yeah.
And so I showed this image to that Marine out in Anaheim, and he started to cry. Right there before me, this big, tall, strong Marine started to cry because he had a daughter, and he had gone through something similar with his own daughter. So. I think, I'm very proud of what we've been able to do with it, and I hope it helps a lot of people. I mean, yoga is not the only thing, obviously, that needs to be done to address mental health issues. And I mentioned that in the book, but also it can be very helpful in its own right.
The great storyteller, Virginia Hamilton, described her work as liberation literature. which I think is a powerful way to describe your work as well, particularly Carry Me Back, because part of how I might define liberation literature is what you've done to preserve and carry on the African American tradition of storytelling, to encapsulate in this book Black joy that, yes, is often intertwined with struggle, to protect generational legacy by naming, affirming, and validating the lived experiences of Black people. What does it mean to you to be a Black creator?
Well, it's a lot. I think, and we talked about folktales and African American folktales and mythos and all kinds of things. And it's one thing, I think, when you're a child to read about Zeus and Hera and Aphrodite and Hercules, and Thor and Odin, right? And then those were what I was exposed to when I was very, very young. And then I got a little older and I, discovered like Anansi and Ogun and the Brer Rabbit stories. And, when that happens, you kind of see yourself in those stories, or aspects of yourself at least, right? And so I think it's for children, I'm thinking that seeing oneself as a way of completing oneself and realizing one's kind of importance in the world and in the universe, and how we can contribute to that, So, one of the things as a Black creator that I try to do is I want to not only show the diversity of Africans and African Americans and African diaspora, right? But also, show that idea and just that whole idea of presence, that, we're here, we belong, a child is here, a child belongs, that whole notion. And I think that's very important. I mean, when I was a little older, in college, there was an African myth or mythos about Oshala, who is an African deity, and particularly in West Africa, who is kind of a multi-gendered individual. And a lot of people talk about like, there's no queerness in West Africa historically. Queerness was brought in by Western civilization, which is not the case. There are a lot of the griots historically in West Africa were people that might be described as being two-spirit or multi-gendered or whatever. And there's even an African deity who was like that, Oshala. And I learned about that when I was a little older, and being an African-American individual who's also gay, and then experiencing and reading about those stories about an African god who was queer, it was very powerful. Yeah. And so I think that, one of the things I try to do with the stories that I write, whether they be my novels or my picture books or screenplays, is to show that type of representation and the power in that representation, and the power of just being who you are and feeling, good in it, right?
Thank you, David.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And this has been a pleasure, talking to you. And I appreciate all the work that you do.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for checking out this episode of the Black Creators Series, a Candlewick Press and Red Clay Educators collaboration. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notifications button so you won't miss an episode. For more information about the Black Creators Series, go to blackcreatorseries.candlewick.com or sonjacherrypaul.com, or go to Red Clay Ed on Twitter and Instagram.